Electronic warfare is the oldest form of combat invisibility. It does not require stealth coatings or low observable airframe geometry or any of the material engineering that makes physical platforms harder to detect. It requires only the understanding that the systems your opponent depends on to fight are themselves dependent on the electromagnetic spectrum, and that the electromagnetic spectrum is a domain that can be contested, degraded, and exploited by anyone with the technical capability and the operational patience to do so. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent 20 years building that capability and exercising that patience in the Persian Gulf, because the Gulf's geography, enclosed, surveilled, trafficked by systems that depend on GPS, radar, and data links, makes it a uniquely target-rich environment for electronic warfare operations. The U.S. Navy's combat systems are among the most sophisticated in the world. They are also among the most dependent on the electromagnetic infrastructure that electronic warfare attacks directly. The destroyer had been operating in the central Persian Gulf for 18 days when the electronic attack began. Not with a bang, not with an obvious signature that the electronic warfare system would flag as a discrete threat event. It began with a drift. The GPS position solution, that the navigation system was continuously computing, began showing a residual error. Small, within the acceptable tolerance band of the system's own quality indicators, consistent with the kind of multipath interference that occurs routinely in the Gulf's shallow water electromagnetic environment. The navigation watch noted the drift, compared it against the inertial navigation system's independent position estimate, found a discrepancy that was within bounds but at the upper end of the expected range, and logged it as a monitoring item. This was at 10:47 p.m. At 10:52 p.m. the drift increased. The GPS quality indicators remained within acceptable bounds. The IRGCN's GPS spoofing system had been designed with sufficient sophistication to maintain the quality indicators at levels that would not immediately trigger the automated alert protocols, while progressively shifting the position solution away from the ship's actual location. The navigation watch observed the increased discrepancy between the GPS position and the inertial navigation position, and escalated the monitoring item to the officer of the deck, who compared the discrepancy against the visible navigational references available. The radar returns of the Gulf coastline to the north, the depth soundings from the echo sounder, the bearing to the identifiable radar feature of an offshore platform 3 nautical miles to the northeast, and concluded that the inertial navigation system's position estimate was more consistent with the available navigational references than the GPS solution. The officer of the deck switched the navigational primary to the inertial system and reported the GPS anomaly to the executive officer. This was at 10:58 p.m. At 11:03 p.m., the electronic warfare system produced an alert that was not an anomaly and was not within any acceptable tolerance band. The alert was a detection, a coordinated set of jamming emissions across multiple frequency bands simultaneously. The data link frequency, the fire control radar's secondary communication channel, the navigation system's secondary GPS receiver, and 2 of the 3 frequencies used by the Aegis Systems cooperative engagement network that link the ship's combat systems to the broader joint air defense architecture. 5 simultaneous jamming emissions, each precisely targeted at a specific frequency band, each at a power level calibrated to degrade without immediately destroying the functionality of the targeted system, to create degradation rather than total failure, because total failure would be immediately obvious and would trigger the most aggressive countermeasures response, while calibrated degradation could be sustained longer and produced more operationally damaging confusion. The electronic warfare officer called the detection to the TAO in the standard format and added a non-standard observation. The emission profile was not consistent with any single ground-based jamming system in the threat library. The frequency coverage, the simultaneous multi-band targeting, and the power calibration across 5 separate bands indicated either a highly sophisticated single platform or, more likely, based on the geographic spread of the emission-bearing estimates, multiple coordinated jamming platforms operating simultaneously from different positions. The EW officer's bearing estimates placed the emission sources at 3 separate bearings, suggesting at least 2 and possibly 3 coordinated Jamming platforms, a network rather than a single asset, operated in concert to achieve the frequency coverage that no single system could provide alone. The commanding officer arrived in the CIC at 11:04 p.m., having been in his sea cabin adjacent to the compartment. He reviewed the EW picture, reviewed the navigation status report, reviewed the Aegis system's self-diagnostic output, which was beginning to show degradation in 2 of its fire control channels. Not failure, degradation, the kind of performance reduction that the system reported in amber rather than red on the status display, and made the assessment that defined the next 40 minutes. The IRGCN was not attacking with missiles or drones. Not yet. It was attacking with the electromagnetic environment, degrading the systems that the ship's combat capability depended on before committing the kinetic assets that the degraded environment was supposed to make more effective. This was not a spontaneous operation. It was a sequenced operation, and the electronic attack was the first sequence. The kinetic attack would follow when the jamming had achieved the degradation its planners had calculated was sufficient. The commanding officer ordered the ship's anti-jamming protocols activated and called for a full system status assessment. The anti-jamming protocols switched the data link to frequency hopping mode, reducing the jamming effectiveness on that channel at the cost of reduced data throughput. They activated the ship's own electronic warfare countermeasures, the active jamming systems that would contest the IRGCN's jamming emissions by injecting competing signals on the affected bands. They switched the Aegis fire control to its degraded mode operating configuration, which maintained core engagement functionality by prioritizing the processing channels that were least affected by the jamming and shedding the ancillary functions that were consuming processing resources without contributing to the engagement critical outputs. The degraded mode configuration had been trained. The watch team knew the procedures. What the training simulations could not replicate was the specific cognitive texture of operating a degraded system, while simultaneously aware that the degradation had been deliberately induced. Something was watching, and that the degradation was preparation for what came next. At 11:14 p.m., the radar picture showed contacts, not through the normal automatic track processing pipeline that the Aegis system ran continuously. That pipeline's output quality had been reduced by the jamming's effect on the system's secondary processing channels, and the contacts appeared first as unclassified returns that the automatic system was holding in a pending queue rather than committing to confirmed track status. The radar operator, working in manual classification mode, reviewing the raw radar returns rather than relying on the automatic processing pipeline, identified the contacts by visual assessment of the radar picture and called them to the TAO before the automatic system had produced its classification. 14 contacts, bearing 008 degrees, range 49 nautical miles, altitude consistent with sea skimming flight between 10 and 18 meters, inbound. The radar operator's manual identification was the operational product of a watch team that had been trained for exactly this degraded environment scenario, not the nominal automated pipeline that worked smoothly in an uncontested electromagnetic environment, but the manual fallback procedures that extracted usable tactical information from degraded system outputs through human judgment rather than automated classification. The radar picture was noisier than normal. The track data was less precise than normal. The position estimates carried larger uncertainty circles than the automatic system would normally produce. None of that prevented the radar operator from seeing 14 inbound contacts and calling them. The fire control solution building was the harder problem. The SM-2's semi-active guidance required a continuous fire control radar illumination signal, the radar maintaining a coherent lock on the target throughout the missile's flight. The fire control radar's illuminator channels were operating in degraded mode, their output reduced by the jamming affecting the radar's secondary processing channels. The illumination signal quality was sufficient to guide a missile, but the degradation introduced additional uncertainty into the terminal phase guidance that reduced the intercept probability compared to nominal system performance. The TAO made the decision to use SM-6 for the outer ring engagement rather than SM-2. The SM-6's active radar seeker operated independently of the ship's fire control radar after initial launch. It needed the ship's radar for the initial target designation, but once the seeker acquired the target, it maintained its own tracking without requiring continued illumination from the ship. In the jamming environment, the SM-6's guidance independence made it more resilient than the SM-2's illuminator dependency. The intercept probability degradation from the jamming would be lower for the SM-6 than for the SM-2 in these conditions. 4 SM-6 interceptors launched at 11:16 p.m. and 22 seconds. The launches came from the forward VLS cells, the vibration transmitting through the hull with the familiar character of a ship fighting, the physical signature of weapons leaving the ship, the statement in steel, and propellant that the electronic attack had not prevented the response it was designed to delay. At 11:16 p.m. and 41 seconds, the jamming intensity increased, not on the same frequencies. The IRGCN's electronic warfare network shifted its power allocation, reducing the jamming on the data link frequency, where the ship's frequency-hopping countermeasure had been effective, and concentrating additional power on the Aegis system's primary, fire, control, radar frequency. The shift was a response. The jamming network had been monitoring the ship's countermeasure activations and had adapted its emission pattern to concentrate power where the ship's countermeasures were less effective. The adaptive jamming was not a fixed program emission. It was operator-directed, with human electronic warfare operators monitoring the ship's countermeasure responses and adjusting the jamming allocation in real time. The fire control radar's performance degraded further. The SM-6 interceptors that had already launched were operating on their own seekers and were unaffected. They were committed and running. The fire control solutions for any subsequent launches were being built on a degraded radar picture with reduced position precision and increased noise floor. The combat systems officer made a decision that was not in the standard operating procedures, but that the situation required. He manually allocated the fire control radar's illuminator output to the 2 highest priority frequency channels, the primary SM-6 guidance designation channel and the ESSM guidance channel, and shut down the secondary illuminator channels that the jamming was consuming processing capacity to service. The shutdown reduced the fire control system's simultaneous engagement capacity, but improved the quality of the output on the channels that remained active. He reported the manual configuration change to the TAO in 3 words: illuminator prioritized, reduced capacity. The TAO acknowledged and continued. First SM-6 intercept at 38 nautical miles. The seeker had acquired and tracked cleanly. The intercept geometry sound. The contacts returned collapsing in the way that confirmed kills appeared on the degraded radar picture. Second SM-6 at 35 nautical miles. Confirmed. Third SM-6. The intercept geometry was displaced by the reduced designation precision from the degraded fire control radar. The initial targeting handoff to the seeker, placing it close to but not on the optimal intercept geometry. The seeker acquired and attempted to correct, but the correction brought it within the lethal radius rather than the center of the kill zone. Probable kill. The contact signature showed structural disruption, but continued for 6 seconds before falling below the tracking floor. Fourth SM-6. Confirmed intercept at 31 nautical miles. 3 confirmed, 1 probable from the first SM-6 salvo. 10 contacts remaining, or 11 if the probable had not achieved a kill. Inside 30 nautical miles. The ESSM engagement began at 22 nautical miles. The ESSM operated in its active guidance mode in the degraded environment, the same seeker independence advantage that had driven the SM-6 selection for the outer ring. 6 ESSM interceptors launched in a rapid sequence from both the forward and aft VLS cells, the fire control system building the launch solutions on the degraded radar picture and accepting the reduced precision in exchange for maintaining engagement tempo. The alternative, Gibausen now, waiting for the radar picture to improve, was not operationally available. The contacts were closing. 4 ESSM intercepts confirmed across the 22 to 14 nautical mile band. 2 misses, both attributable to the reduced designation precision that the jamming was imposing on the initial targeting handoff, both in the same category as the SM-6 probable kill, where the seeker had acquired, but the geometry correction had been insufficient for a center of kill detonation. 5 contacts remaining inside 14 nautical miles, or 6, if one of the ESSM misses had not achieved a probable kill. The jamming intensity remained at its elevated level. The fire control radar's performance had stabilized at its degraded mode floor. The combat systems officer's manual prioritization had prevented further deterioration, and the active electronic countermeasures the ship was broadcasting were contesting the jamming emissions with enough effectiveness to maintain the stabilized degraded performance. Not nominal, not improving. Stable at degraded. The remaining contacts were inside the CIWS engagement threshold. The forward CIWS mount was in automatic engagement mode and had been tracking the contacts throughout the outer and middle ring engagements, building and updating its fire control solutions continuously as the contacts closed. The CIWS's own X-band radar operated on a frequency band that the IRGCN's jamming network had not specifically targeted. An oversight or a deliberate choice to conserve jamming power for the higher-value fire control channels, or a technical limitation of the jamming network's frequency coverage. Whatever the reason, the CIWS radar was operating in its normal mode. Its tracking was clean. Its fire control was unaffected by the jamming that was degrading every other engagement system on the ship. The contacts were at 8 nautical miles. 7. 6. The CIWS mount was tracking them all, prioritizing by range and approach bearing. Its fire control computer updating the engagement queue as the contact's closing geometries evolved. At 11:22 p.m. and 4 seconds, the jamming stopped. All 5 jamming emitters went silent simultaneously. Not a progressive reduction, an abrupt cessation, all 5 frequency bands clearing at the same moment. The ship's EW system registered the cessation and reported it in the same tone it reported every other system event. The Aegis system's degraded mode performance indicators began updating immediately as the jamming-induced noise cleared from the processing channels. Amber indicators transitioning toward green as the system's self-diagnostics confirmed the return of nominal electromagnetic conditions. The fire control picture snapped back to normal quality in approximately 4 seconds of post-jamming stabilization. The contacts that had been carrying 50-meter position uncertainty circles resolved to their normal meter-scale precision. The 5 contacts inside 6 nautical miles were suddenly precisely located, their positions, speeds, and approach geometries clear on the display, in the way that clear-air, uncontested radar tracking always was. The jamming had stopped because its operational purpose had been completed, or because the personnel operating it had assessed that the attack had progressed far enough into the engagement envelope that continued jamming no longer offered sufficient additional advantage to justify continued electromagnetic signature exposure. The jamming network's operators had been running a risk-managed emission throughout the attack, knowing that their own transmissions were detectable and that U.S. assets, aircraft, ships, shore stations were collecting on the emissions and building targeting data for any follow-on response. At some point in the engagement, the risk of continued emission exceeded the benefit. That point had apparently arrived. The CIWS engaged the 5 remaining contacts at ranges between 5.8 and 3.1 nautical miles. The clean radar picture produced clean engagement solutions. The CIWS operating at its nominal performance levels against contacts, whose exact positions and velocities it now knew precisely. First contact eliminated at 5.4 nautical miles. Second contact at 4.1 nautical miles. Third contact at 3.2 nautical miles. The burst requiring a tracking correction as the contact executed a terminal bearing deviation, but the correction succeeded. Fourth contact at 2.7 nautical miles. Fifth contact at 2.1 nautical miles. 5 contacts, 5 engagements, 5 eliminations by the CIWS in the 31 seconds following the jamming cessation. At 11:22 p.m. and 35 seconds, the radar picture was clear. 19 minutes and 35 seconds from the first EW system alert to the last CIWS engagement. 14 contacts engaged across SM6, ESSM, and CIWS layers. 0 hull impacts. 0 personnel casualties. The navigation system's GPS had returned to nominal accuracy within 40 seconds of the jamming cessation. The inertial navigation system's accumulated drift from the unaided period within the expected parameters for an 18-minute inertial-only interval. The Aegis system's self-diagnostic completed its post-jamming assessment and reported all fire control channels returned to nominal performance. The weapon's expenditure log recorded 4 SM-6 interceptors, 6 ESSM interceptors, and approximately 2,800 rounds of 20mm through the CIWS. Total interceptor cost, approximately $43 million. The post-engagement electronic warfare analysis identified 2 findings that were not apparent during the engagement itself. The first was the adaptive jamming sophistication. The shift of power from the data link frequency to the fire control radar frequency, executed within seconds of the ship's frequency-hopping countermeasure activation, indicated real-time operator judgment rather than pre-programmed sequencing. The IRGCN's electronic warfare operators had been monitoring the ship's countermeasure responses and adapting in real time, a level of operational skill that the threat assessment had undervalued. The second finding was the cessation timing. The jamming had stopped at the precise moment when the remaining contacts entered the CIWS engagement envelope, calculated to minimize emission exposure time while accepting the CIWS would handle the terminal layer. The IRGCN had modeled the engagement outcome. Their goal had never been the contacts reaching the hull. It had been the consumption of SM-6 and ESSM inventory under degraded conditions. Under nominal performance, 14 contacts at these ranges would have required approximately 12 interceptors. The degraded engagement consumed 10 interceptors to achieve 9 confirmed kills, pushing 5 contacts into the CIWS layer rather than the 2 or 3 that nominal performance would have left there. 20% more interceptors, 5 terminal contacts instead of 2. The jamming had not prevented the defense. It had made the defense more expensive. That was its purpose, and it had achieved it. The commanding officer added a single observation to the analysis team's findings before transmitting the final after-action report. The radar operator's manual classification of the initial contacts before the degraded automatic pipeline had cleared its pending queue. Sapor spoad. Fratins. Y1WC. Engagement's first critical decision. Waiting for the automated system would have delayed the outer ring engagement by approximately 90 seconds. At the contact's closure rate, 90 seconds was 7 nautical miles of intercept margin surrendered before the first SM-6 left the cell. 7 nautical miles in a layered engagement, where every mile of outer ring range was margin preserved for the inner rings. The training had been the answer to the jamming that was designed to prevent it. The electronic spectrum returned to its normal ambient character after the engagement. The jamming emitters that had operated from 3 bearings went silent and remained silent. The EW system continued its passive monitoring, logging every emission in the Gulf's electromagnetic environment with the same continuous automated patience that it applied regardless of whether anything unusual was present. Nothing unusual was present. The Persian Gulf does not announce its intentions. It operates in the background of every mission, every transit, every evolution. An electromagnetic environment as contested as its surface, operated by an adversary that understands the value of degrading a system before attacking it. The watch team had held in that environment on this night not by being immune to the degradation, but by being trained for it, by having practiced the manual procedures and the manual judgment that remain functional when the automated systems have been reduced to their degraded mode floor. The systems are the ship's capability. The training is the ship's resilience. On this night, the resilience had been enough. It is always the training, in the end, that holds the line.